Yes, this is, I think, actually 25, book number 25. And I think it's my best book, okay? But then I have to say that, because if I said book number 3 was my best book, nobody would read this book. So I say this is my best book. And I also think it's my best book because it's the first book I self-published. And if you want a session on the ins and outs of self-publishing, and I have strong views on publishers and a whole series of other things, I'm not sure that self-publishing is the way out of that conundrum. There are so many difficult paths that you have to actually follow to get through the mystique of that. And that's even when you've got somebody you can work with that can do the copy editing. But what I was trying to do with this book, and Malcolm here's got a copy of it, is that it is in full colour. And this is one thing I feel that publishers should be much more adept at doing. They will occasionally give you full colour, by which they mean they will put a few colour sheets in the centre of the book. But this has the colour on every sheet in the places that it's meant to be. Also, the quality of the paper and everything else like that is far higher than you would get in most books. So it's not published as cheap as you might do, but I think that the product is a much better product for that. And if any of you are aspiring authors, I would be really encouraging you to try and push the publishers as hard as you can on getting them to do what you want, rather than everything being the other way around and you're just left to pick up the pieces from what they want you to do. But so much for the being the self-publisher, I'm also the promotions department and everything else. So at various stages I may be putting in little plugs here and there into your subconscious mind, so sort of to hope that you actually then follow up some of the leads. So see if this machine works. Brilliant. What I want to do then is to sort of just put a sort of little bit of background and then talk about certain parts of the book that I've really enjoyed actually doing it. And here's the first plug. There is a website. It's not a difficult website to remember. It's the title of the book, .org.uk. But what really struck me to begin with was that is the issue of inequality important? And looking at it more generally, not within the transport context, it says a lot about us as a society. That are we prepared to live with huge levels of inequality, not just within cities or within the UK, but globally as well. It reflects on the views of the society as a whole. And if you look at most of the literature, and we can talk a bit about some of the measures here as well later on, I would argue that there is a greater concentration, particularly of wealth, across all societies and within societies. So the rich are getting richer, and the poor are probably getting poorer, but they're not getting richer at the same rate at which the rich are getting. And this is particularly important in countries, say, like China, where there is a rapidly emerging middle class. And their aspirations are to get richer. Their aspirations are to catch up with the people that are towards the top end of the income distribution. But what we find is that they're not playing catch up. They're slipping further and further behind. So the top is moving away, the middle is staying roughly where it is, and the bottom is also slipping away, which again is leading to this overall change. And this in turn may be part of the arguments for things like populism, for people being disillusioned with the elites, disillusioned with the power structures as they are, and this again may lead to instability and fragmentation. So outside of transport, that is, seems to be what is happening. But the question I was trying to answer was, do the same sorts of arguments apply within the transport sector as well? And we recognise that societies, people require transport to move around. The whole way in which global societies are organised are that we need to get around, and increasingly we need to travel more probably and travel further. And secondly, one would accept that not everybody requires the same level of mobility as all others. And even people within one particular group, their mobility requirements will themselves change over time as well. So my mobility requirements are rather different now to what they were 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So we must accept that there is not homogeneity here, there is a wide variety, heterogeneity within societies. So having said that, perhaps we need to accept that inequality does exist and it will continue to exist. We're not arguing that everything will be the same for everyone. And again, then what one is trying to do is to looking at the nature and the scale of that, looking at issues as how that impacts upon different groups of people, different quality of our life, and also, and I think this is really important in terms of the sort of public policy dimension to it, is looking at whether decisions that are made about investment, decisions that are made about subsidy, are they fair? Do they actually address some of these issues that people in certain groups are benefit much more than other people who are in other groups? So it's looking at the distribution, it's looking at the nature and the scale of the change. The book itself is in 4 parts. First is about sort of mainly from the economic literature. There was a lot of very interesting work here. I was inspired by the work of Piketty. This was what set me going in the first place in terms of particularly his analysis of wealth over a period of 400 or 500 years. And others, in particular, mention people like Amartya Sen and John Rawls as well. There's also then the second part is looking at the UK more in terms of what people actually do, which is part of the inequality question. Thirdly, to the third part of the book looks at the wider perspective, looking at well-being, mobility, and looking at the issues of sustainability and the time dimension, including some work on intergenerational issues. And then finally, looking at the way forward. And what I want to do is to briefly cover something from each of the sections 2, 3, and 4 in this presentation. So, if we look at the empirical evidence, overall society is much more mobile than it was. Not unexpected. Something of an order of 5 times increase over the period from 1960 to the recent past, and this reflects both the availability and the affordability of transport. It also reflects on lifestyles, on how transport systems are much not just national but international, global, and if we're looking at freight as well, the goods that we consume are also transported much further than they used to be. But also the costs of transport are rising, particularly the social and environmental costs. And by that would include crashes, safety issues, congestion, security, severance pollution, climate issues, amenities, open space, and health. So the sort of empirical evidence here is about whether we consider the costs are fairly distributed, and also whether the benefits are fairly distributed of decisions that are made within transport, either by ourselves or by others on our behalf. And I try and sort of frame this within 2 different perspectives. One is the more libertarian perspective, which is suggesting that the rights of the individuals are paramount within society. And to my mind, this has led to the dominance of the car paradigm. This is why the car has become so dominant, because we've moved along that pathway towards a more libertarian perspective. In the Rawlsian terms, they would say yes, but this has not been fair. This has been that the rich have gained much more than the poor. And he would go further than that. He would say that those gains have often been at the expense of those people that are less well off. So it's a sort of double indemnity that's actually taken place there. So that might seem a little bit abstract to you, but if we put some numbers onto this, and the main empirical part of the book has taken the National Travel Survey for this country for the 10-year period from 2002 until 2012. So we work with a database of about 4 million trips over that period of time collected in the National Travel Survey. And even that level of, that number of trips doesn't allow us to really dig down very deeply into that data. We would love to have done some work on regional differences and things, but the data is just not enough data there to do it. And what we've tended to do with most of the analysis, but not all of it, is to divide the population, divide the travelling into income levels. Income deciles, that's 10%, or as here, where we've got enough data, income ventiles. So that's 5% in each of the ventiles, so 20 groups to make up the 100. So if we contrast in terms of car travel, if we contrast the top and the bottom, we find that for car travel, the lowest ventile, i.e. people in the lowest income groups, make about 200 trips per year. In the highest income groups, 550. So there's a factor of about 2 to 3 difference between the top and the bottom. If we look at distance, the factor is about 4 to 5, not unexpected. Taxis, minicabs, interesting in the sense that the lowest income groups and the highest income groups are the two main users of taxis. But it's in between or a lower level. I'll leave you to work out, or we can the explanations or the possible explanations for that. If we take walking trips, the lowest income group, 300 trips plays against 200 trips. So for the low income groups, they make more trips by walking than the highest income groups. Cycling, across the board, not much difference between that, apart from the extremely low level of cycling overall. These are trips per year, not trips per day or trips per week. You guys in Oxford may have a slightly different perspective on this, but I'm sure that there are others in the country that making a bike trip is a major undertaking. Bus trips, again, I suppose not unexpected, but the degree of difference to my mind was much greater than I thought. The lowest income groups, 113 trips by bus a year, the highest income groups, 31. Rail trips, 14 plays 50, and rail distance, 350 plays 1850. This is London Underground again. The higher income groups making more than 3 times as many trips. So in that sense, I don't think that there are many surprises. I think what was surprising in some cases was the degree of difference. But if you look at the highest income groups, whether we're talking about the amount of time, the numbers of trips, or the distance travelled, it is always much more than any other group. So in any type of the metrics you want to use, it's that group that seems to be doing most of having the highest levels of mobility. So the sort of conclusions that we would come to from this is that walking is the most equitable form of transport, whether we talk about trips, distance or time. And they also make this much greater use of the bus than all other income groups by distance and the number of trips. If we look across in the middle group, the similar patterns true for taxi and car passenger trips, but the rich travel much further as car passengers than the poor do. So, and cycling, a small income effect, minor for trips, but when distance is true, then the rich travel much further by cycle and also by taxi. And then finally, if we look at the bottom part of this slide, we find that for the car driver, the car passenger element, it's the rich who dominate on all of our 3 metrics, trips, distance and travel time. And the scale there is high for trips, even higher for distance, and less so for travel time. So they spend more time travelling for non-work related activities, but as I mentioned earlier, the difficulty of actually then drilling down further by location makes that difficult. We were able to isolate what was happening in London. London is very different to the rest of the country, but I haven't got the time to talk about that. What I would like to do is just to concentrate a little bit on rail and air, because I think rail and air, to my mind, say quite a lot about the way in which decisions are made on investments and on subsidy, particularly in this country, but elsewhere. You may not have seen that. That's a high-speed rail train. They're very rare in this country. Occasionally seen going out of St Pancras and often seen in marshalling yards as well, I understand. We don't have a high-speed rail network in here, but in this country, but we do have an extensive rail network. And long-distance travel by rail and by other forms of transport in this country aren't a large part of trips, but they are quite an element in travel distance. I think the interesting thing that we found from this was that about half the population don't use the railways. Okay, and this has changed somewhat. It's increased to 58, probably 60% even now. So it's changed from 50% to 60%. And this is partly, I think, because the network it's a dense network in one sense, but it's quite a sparse network. There are many parts of the country that don't have a very intensive rail network. Living in the southeast and living in this area in particular, perhaps we get a distorted view. If you live in London, you get a very distorted view about travel. So if you look at Londoners, something like 70 or 80% will be using the rail system there, but elsewhere it's very much lower. And then if we look at rail, about half of rail users are regular. There are many young people or youngish people, working age people, having higher than average income levels, and as I've just said, it's heavily concentrated in this part of the country. If we just look at the high-speed rail, and we've taken a fairly sort of generous interpretation of high speed, but I understand that's now consistent with government policy because high speed is becoming less by the day. But the high speed 2, they're looking at actually running it at about 200 miles an hour or kilometres an hour, 220 kilometres an hour now, because that will reduce the investment and also allow it to travel through tunnels that are slightly narrower than it would be if they were running at an even higher speed. But if we compare that with France, with the French TGV system that is much more comprehensive than ours, that does have high-speed rail and a network of 2,700 kilometres, we have a similar sort of picture. In this country, the top 20% make 63% of all long-distance high-speed rail journeys. The corresponding figure in France is 40%. Okay, it's still disproportionate, but not as great. If we look at different sorts of ratios for this, the Palmer ratio is one which I would strongly urge people who are interested in this type of work to have a look at. This takes the top 10% and looks at that as a ratio of the bottom 40%. The argument there used by this Italian economist is that, roughly speaking, that the top 10% make as much use of something as the bottom 40% does. Not just in travel, but in terms of generally in terms of consumption. The five ratios, the top 5% versus the bottom 5%, and the 20 and 10 are the corresponding figures. So if we look at high-speed rail, we have a factor somewhere between 8 and 10, say. For other long distances, it's between 5 and 6, or 5 and 7, and for short distances, between just over 3 and 4 and a bit, depending on which index one uses. Basically, that's saying is that the richest groups are making 10 times as much, or 7 times as much for long distance, or about 4 times as much for the short distance rail. And you can see with the different coloured here, this sort of graphic, which is one which one gets on all of, or almost all of these, on all of these distributions. And this is done by the Ventiles again, the the 20 ventiles. So this is saying that it's the high income groups, the spatial inequality, I suppose, as well in terms of where it takes place, but mainly there's income inequality as one uses, or as one's income rises, and the use one makes of high-speed rail and other types of rail. And again, if we look at air travel, we get the same type of distribution. So here, this data is not from the NTS, this data is from the Civil Aviation Authority, where now people are travelling much longer on longer distance travel, including aviation. And if we're looking at the same sort of indices, the Palmer ratio is 7, and the other ones are between 5 and 7 for air travel. Again, strongly skewed towards the higher income groups. But it's not just this overall picture that is important here. It's trying to look at, say, who flies. And here again, we find that in this 53% have not flown in the last 12 months. How many of you have not flown in the last 12 months? So we've got a very typical audience here, one person. You're the 53% and the rest is the 47%. What I found interesting was that this figure has been roughly stable over the last 15 years. Okay, so it's not saying that the same people are flying or the same people are not flying, but if you look at it at that sort of aggregate level, then you find that that hasn't changed much. And one of my favourite sort of questions on this is, okay, this has coincided with the rise in the low-cost airlines, and one of the arguments about low-cost airlines is that it allows people who can't afford higher fares to travel by air. But is that the case, or is the case that it allows those that can afford to travel by air to travel more by air? And so that the low-cost airlines are being used by the same income groups. And we looked at this across all the major airports, 6 major airports in the UK and some of the minor airports. And if we look at the socioeconomic classes of those travelling by air, it is very similar across all airports. The only differences really are that City Airport has a higher proportion of very rich people because much of that is business travel, and Stansted, Ryanair's hub airport, could be seen as being somewhat different in having, as it were, a lower socioeconomic class mix in terms of the people using Stansted Airport. But even if we look at those who have flown, most of those have made just one return trip. So 20% of those who have flown had made 1%, 11% 2, and it ends up that about 10% of people are making 60% of the flights. How many of you guys are in that 10%? I think I probably am, or was. Yeah, so it's saying again, it's sort of, in a sense, it's suggesting that a few of us are having a much bigger impact on the whole issue than many others have. And I think, as well as the sort of the direct effects, obviously, a lot or a few of us flying a lot more than perhaps we should do, or making a bigger contribution to the profits of the airlines, is also thinking in terms of inequality. That's one aspect of it, but I think airlines illustrate another aspect of inequality that is often not really thought about as much. This is what Ian Goff has called a double injustice. He's suggesting that the poor, those that in this case don't fly, have lower levels of consumption, contribute less to climate change, but they are also the ones that are likely to be impacted by the actions of others, by these negative effects, and they have, or they don't know the means by which they can really seek recompense for that. So they're the ones that are most adversely impacted. And if one looks in terms of the wider perspective, there's been this big increase in air travel since 1990, and it's expected to continue, and figures such as 20% or something like that of CO2 emissions could be coming from the aviation sector, partly because of its growth, but partly because it's difficult to reduce the carbon emissions from aviation, and partly because other sectors can reduce more easily. So although the total amount will be maybe stable or reducing, aviation's contribution will be continuing. So what this is suggesting then perhaps is that the way we ought to be looking at this is not just in terms of the direct effects, but in terms of the indirect effects of people's action on questions relating to equality. The third part of the book takes a sort of more of a sideways look at notions of inequality, arguing that what people do, as reflected in the National Travel Survey, is only part of the picture, because that's only what people do, the travel that they undertake. It's not saying anything more about the quality of that, what they can't get access to, what they can't do, and a whole series of other related questions. And here I delved a lot into the well-being literature, and it's vast. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the capability approach at one level appealed very much, and this is where it's looking at the ability to achieve, to take up valued functionings. Those are what Amartya Sen's words are, but it also looks at questions related to satisfaction and freedoms and the opportunities available. I found this really interesting, but enormously difficult to actually translate into the transport framing, and partly I think this is because as it were, the history of the baggage that I had carry as well with my background in transport and notions of measurement and pseudo-rationality and that sort of thing, and Sen's sort of much more open view about what we should be talking about, and he would be one of the first people to say, think about whether you really want to try and measure it, or do you just want to try and use it as some sort of a framing device within which you can begin to understand what's going on. Within the transport sector, I think the nearest thing I've come to is notions of motility, which is the Kaufman idea. Because it covers this question about organising life, everyday life, but it also includes notions of access and access rights to opportunities. It also has something about the skills and knowledge that people have, and what is quite important is some sort of evaluation, some sort of feedback into the process to sort of say about experiences, but also about the suitability. That's beginning to get near to a broader notion of well-being. Accessibility is the one that's most widely used in the transport sector, and my guess is that that's the one that is likely to continue to be most extensively used. But we, as I say here, must accept its limitations. It talks about travel time reductions, or looking at thresholds, or looking at what you can do within certain time limits. It still treats time as a commodity. It still treats time in a very sort of narrow way, not in this wider notion of it as a much broader resource notion. And it doesn't really say very much about the suitability or the limitations of the destination, and again, it's more looking at averages. It's still primarily based within the rationality paradigm, which takes us so far, but I would say it doesn't take us really far enough if we're getting into issues relating to inequality. And the second part of this section in the book looks at the time issues and sustainability, which is one of the areas that I've worked in quite extensively. Here I think again it's the indirect effects and the impact on the poor that's important, but there is this much more general conflict between the desire for greater mobility that maybe we all have and the need to reduce the impact on the planet, particularly impact by the rich or by those that travel more on the planet and the use of resources. I found that there's a very interesting sort of paper by Mona Chitnis and a series of others suggesting that if we look at the carbon content of broad consumption patterns of different groups of people, it's often the necessities that have the highest carbon factor within it, whether it's related to transport or processing or whatever it is. So that relates to home heating, it relates to the food that people eat and that sort of thing. But given that, the richest 10% of households still produce 3 times the carbon of the poorest 10%, and for road transport the differences are much higher and aviation even higher. So it's saying that it's really difficult to get away from this problem whether you're in a rich or a poor household against trying to reduce your carbon impact. But in terms of more the transport effects, the issues here to my mind relate to things that have a differential impact on different groups within societies. So location decisions, whether it's new development, whether it's closures of post offices, closures of schools, whether it's concentration, hospital specialisation. Often the costs of travel to get to these facilities is pushed on to the user of the facilities rather than the producer. So if you close your local school, you've got to get away, getting the kids to the school further away. If you have regional hospitals, and there are good reasons for having those with specialisms and that sort of thing, it's harder for people to get to those, or some people to get to those facilities. There's the health effects that often, and the data here, or the information here is very sparse about people living near to sources of pollution, near to roads and things. Often the least able people, the poorer people, they are higher risk in terms of health effects, pollution, and they haven't got the resources to remove even if they could. And then thirdly, the subsidy issue is again heavily oriented towards the rich, whether it's aviation, rail or motoring costs. There are subsidies, some overt, some less overt. It is the bus that is, we've already said, is the mode that is mainly used by those that are less well off, yet this is the form of transport that gets least subsidy. And so we find ourselves in a position that where the money is available, it seems to be putting into those activities that are encouraging the rich to travel further by those forms of transport that are most expensive and probably most carbon intensive. So where does this all lead us? I don't know. I've got this characteristic that the more I talk, the gloomier I get. I think it's maybe, I always try to be cheerful. You said I was cheerful. You don't know me that well. It's when I get gloomy. That's when the problems actually occur. But I think there are positive messages that one can take away from this. I think that we don't really, or we haven't really, as a group, dug that much really deeply into these issues. But the sorts of conclusions that I came up with, there's some for policy and some for planning. There's no getting away. We should much more explicitly tackle issues relating to social well-being. And this goes beyond, and I'm guilty of this as well, what people actually do, the travel they make. But it covers, or should cover, their experiences and their capabilities, what they are able, their functionings and other factors that are important in this. And we should be much more explicit about distribution effects. I'm not sure if this is a new paradigm. I think it's this. I was toying with this as to whether sort of to push it in that direction. I don't think it can be encompassed within the existing paradigm, and that's what worries me. That if you talk to people in the Department of Transport and things, they're saying, well, we do this, we do that, but it's what I call marginal rather than central to the way in which they look at these issues. So we need a wider interpretation of growth and well-being rather than a narrow one which is based on the sort of the rationality type paradigm. We need to use less. Is that right? Non-renewable resources. Less non-renewable resources. Yeah. We need to direct public investment and subsidy much more clearly at those who are deemed to be disadvantaged. So, I mean, here, for instance, you know, in terms of subsidies in the UK, rail subsidies get 45%, buses receive the other 55%. Means an average for each household is that sort of number, and the rich receive twice as much as the poor, mainly because they travel much further and they are the beneficiaries primarily of rail subsidy. And to broaden the debate, it's not just about travel, it's about trying to look at what constitutes a reasonable quality of life, and to trying to look at ways in which we can raise human capital through education, through better health, through a greater awareness of the environmental issues. And then on the planning side, the measurement data issue is something which, again, has perhaps caused quite a lot of worry to me in terms of what I should say about this. And here I think the basic conundrum is that, and this is why I think that we're looking at perhaps a new paradigm rather than something that's more adjusting what's going on at the moment, is should we be searching for some form of measure, some sort of metric, some sort of quantification that relates to social well-being, quality of life, and all these other aspects? Should there be a much more contextual, a much more fundamental discussion about inequality, fairness, justice within society more wholly? And this would be moving us away from the numbers game much more towards a richer, I suppose, but more subjective understanding of what's actually going on. Cost-benefit analysis and investment favours, or still favours, large-scale projects, not local transport. And this again suggests perhaps that we should be looking at a slightly a different sort of means to look at options that relate to local transport, but we all have this responsibility to consume less. And one argument would be whether we're investing in high-speed rail, whether we're investing in new airport capacity, that is encouraging people to consume more, not consume less. I mentioned the subsidy and fairness issue, that these should be much, much better targeted towards those that are deemed to be in need of the subsidy, and it should be looking at ways of encouraging innovation and encouraging innovation that would help alleviate inequality. The issues of double justice, the rights of people to live a clean, healthy, safe, secure life in a quiet environment, is something that doesn't seem to have been really extensively worked on, and this is part of the obligation, I suppose, that society has to ensure that those people that are imposing extra costs should be aware of that and pay for it. And finally here is that people are not all treated equally. Rationality, utilitarian rationality, favours the rich. We need perhaps to have this much more broader debate over a much more normative value system to try and include an appreciation of and action on those things that affect the people that are less well off, so that fairness and justice can be something that can be subscribed to more fully. So I think four messages I want to leave you with. that the way we should be looking at this perhaps is we can reduce inequality, but we need to meet the needs of the disadvantaged in an affordable way. And I've steered clear of much of this. To my mind, walking, bike, that sort of thing is one way of addressing those sorts of questions, because they are forms of transport that are accessible and affordable for most of the population. Analysis should be much more open about including distributional effects. We are mainly concerned when we do analysis with averages, rather than looking at the gainers and the losers. And this should be really important part of understanding public policy and how public funds are allocated. We should be concerned more about the quality of the local environment and protect the rights of those people who live there to a reasonable and, if possible, a high quality of life. And perhaps transport should be seen as much more of a cross-cutting activity rather than something in its own right that provides connectivity, but it also contributes to the quality of the local environment and contributes to the quality of life for those people who are living in those areas. So one of the benefits for me of retirement has been productivity is increased by a factor goodness knows what. And that may be good news for me, but it may be really bad news for you guys, because that gives you more of my thoughts to possibly read. But so I retired 3 years ago now, and I'm living to 128, I think. I think somebody said to me my lifeline was quite long, so more books on the way perhaps. But as you can see, I've moved a bit outside of transport as well. So we work with some colleagues in Norway on looking at what we call a sustainable development space in this one. That's what I've been talking about today, and this is due out next July, which is looking primarily at the Brundtland report, 30 years after it was published in 1987, and asking 3 questions about it. Has it achieved very much? Is it still relevant today? And where should we be looking in the future in terms of moving towards sustainable development? So that will be out next July. And with that, I would say thank you.